The following is an encore recording of a presentation that was given to the faculty, staff, and students of the Doctor of Social Work program at Rutgers University on May 11th, 2024. My name is Amy Geller. I'm a therapist in private practice. I am a clinical director of A Home Within, which is a nonprofit that provides accessible psychotherapy to people who've experienced foster care. I'm a recent DSW graduate, and I am an adoptee. Today, I'd like to give you a brief introduction to a phenomenon experienced by many adoptees, yet little understood by the general public and the mental health field. This is known as coming out of the fog. Some adoptees prefer to use the term adoptee consciousness or adoptee awareness, but many adoptees do refer to coming out of the fog. I call this a living experience as opposed to a lived one, because for many adoptees, the experience of adoption is a forever, lifelong experience that unfolds across the lifespan. So, why did I decide to pursue a doctorate 3 years ago? I began my social work career 30 years ago, and I started as a hospital social worker, and then I spent many years providing hospice care. When I opened my private practice in 2011, I was not really interested in working with adoptees, but I think the universe may have had other plans. I started to get many referrals for adolescents, usually around 8th or ninth grade, usually female, and they were coming to me with very similar academic, emotional, and behavioral issues. I quickly tracked that many of them happened to be adopted. And I say happened to be because a really curious thing would happen. The parents would call me, and after a lengthy phone call where they would provide a long list of issues their child was dealing with, they would say right before we hung up, kind of as an afterthought, and by the way, I don't know if it matters, but my child happens to be adopted. So, being an adoptee myself, this was curious to me and I leaned in. But I quickly became frustrated with the lack of resources and understanding for this population. So I decided to pursue a doctorate where I could engage in scholarship and research that would fill the gap in understanding adolescent adoptees. I spent my first year focusing my work on the role of ambiguous loss, which is a term coined by Pauline Boss, in the relationships between adoptees and their adoptive families. And I'm still very dedicated to working with adolescent adoptees and assisting their families in building connection. But I wasn't really prepared for what happened next. So we've all heard the expression building the plane while flying it. This was my actual experience of coming out of the fog while researching it, while pursuing a doctorate. Here's what happened. In the years leading up to my return to school, my adoptive father died suddenly and unexpectedly. A short time later, I had the opportunity to find out who my biological father was and was able to meet him. But by the time I met him, he was terminally ill, and so we only had a couple of years to get to know each other. But these events of loss catapulted me into an emotional experience of both grief and understanding and awareness about myself as an adoptee. It was a very confusing and lonely time for me. I felt really deeply misunderstood by so many people in my life, particularly my adoptive family with whom I had always been close, and quite frankly, even my own therapist. But with the help of the adoptee community and lots of reading and research, I came to understand what was happening with me. I was an adoptee in middle age coming out of the fog. So, when we tend to think of adoption, we sort of think of it as a fixed event that usually takes place in childhood. But what happens when adoptees grow up? It's hard to say exactly how many adoptees there are living in the United States at this time because historically record keeping has been quite inconsistent. But we do know about one period in our country's history known as the baby scoop era. This took place towards the end of World War II in 1945 and before Roe v. Wade in 1973. We know that during these years, a huge number of crisis pregnancies resulted in an adoption boom, and that there were approximately 4 million U.S. adoptions during this phase. Those adoptees in 2024 are now 51 to 79 years old. It is very likely that we will all encounter adult adoptees in our social work practice. So it's important to be aware of some of these big statistics. Adoptees are at a higher risk of experiencing emotional, physical, and sexual abuse in the homes that they grow up in. Adoptees are also more vulnerable to experience substance use disorders. And adoptees are 4 times more likely than non adoptees to attempt suicide. We know that adoptees are overrepresented in all mental health settings and are often pathologized, misdiagnosed, and misunderstood, when in actuality, much of what adult adoptees deal with are normal responses to trauma. I believe that any conversation about adoption must include a consideration of trauma. It's been widely debated in the research for the past decade or so, but there have been some recent studies in 2022 that have made an excellent case for this connection. Here's just a little bit of what the research is pointing to. Adoptees are much more likely to experience prenatal stress before they're even born. Furthermore, every single adoption, regardless of the circumstances or the age that it occurs, starts with an attachment disruption. Thanks to neuroscience, we also have a greater understanding now of infant mental health. So we know that there are memories, implicit and pre-verbal memories, that are stored in our brains and our bodies from even our earliest experiences. Before we can dive into coming out of the fog, let's define the fog. This refers to a time before adoptees start to examine and question the narratives around their adoptive experience. In the United States today, the dominant narratives around adoption are the following. 1, that it is a win-win solution for a child in need of a home. 2, that it is an alternative for folks who want to pursue parenthood. 3, it's a solution to infertility. And 4, it's a part of a much bigger political conversation around reproductive justice. Yet many adoptees have told me it wasn't until much later in life that they began to look deeper underneath these narratives and question their experience. We're not really sure where the term the fog comes from, but some adoptee scholars have attributed it to a seminal work written by fellow adoptee Betty Jean Lifton. In her book, Lost and Found, The Adoption Experience, Miss Lifton refers to the great sleep of adoption. She wrote, "It is as if the act of adoption put us under a spell that numbed our consciousness. When we awaken, it startles us to realize we might have slept our lives away, floating and uprooted." So coming out of the fog, then, is a time where the adoptee begins to critically question and examine their experience. This can be a very confusing and isolating time for the adoptee because oftentimes it comes out of nowhere, or seems to anyway. To clinicians, this can look like acute anxiety or a major depressive episode. I've had adoptees come to me having been misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder or bipolar disorder. And many adoptees carry diagnoses from childhood, such as oppositional defiant disorder and reactive attachment disorder. But we in the adoptee community want you to know that coming out of the fog is a normative and not a pathological experience. It is a human right to know who you are and to grieve what you've lost. It's important to know that coming out of the fog can take place regardless of the quality of adoptive family relationships. And it's also important to know that this often does not take place until later in middle age. Some common triggers of coming out of the fog are the death of an adoptive parent, the birth of a child, taking a direct-to-consumer DNA test, or being diagnosed with a medical condition and not having any medical history, or search and reunion with biological family members. When somebody is coming out of the fog, the adoptee here is dealing with layers and layers of complicated and disenfranchised grief. For many adoptees, they have not been given the space, either at home or out in the world, to grieve the many layers of loss that they have experienced. It's also a time where adoptees may begin to question the narratives that they've been told around their experience. Fellow adoptee researcher Amanda Baden has done research on microaggressions and adoptees. She coined the term microfictions. Microfictions refer to the stories we make around adoption to sort of soften the harder edges or the more unpleasant details of it. One of the most famous microfictions around adoption is "Your mother loved you so much she gave you away." This may be a time where adult adoptees begin to make connections and look in the rearview mirror at experiences they had when they were younger and make connections between these experiences and these feelings towards trauma. It's also a time where adoptees will start to critically examine perhaps their own upbringing and may even begin to critically examine the practice of adoption as economically and politically motivated. An important aspect of coming out of the fog is that it's an opportunity for the adoptee to rework their identity. Oftentimes, they will go from saying that they were adopted, something that happened to them, to being an adoptee, which is a lifelong identity. These feelings can reemerge across the lifespan at every life stage. One of the things that drew me to a doctorate program at Rutgers was that I would have the opportunity to conduct a qualitative research study. It has always been my goal to amplify the voices of fellow adoptees in all spaces because historically adoptees have told me they have felt marginalized and silenced. So in my second year, I was fortunate enough to be able to conduct a qualitative research study with adult adoptees. I wanted to understand what the adult adoptees were experiencing with psychotherapy. I interviewed 15 adoptees from across the country. Many of them were middle aged. And for the sake of this conversation, it's important to note that of the 15 I spoke with, 13 had endorsed coming out of the fog. So this study right now is under peer review, and I'm hoping to get it published so that it will add to the conversation and add to adoptee voices in academic research. In the spirit of amplifying adoptee voices, I have made a short video for you today, and in it, you're going to hear from fellow adult adoptees who will share their experiences and thoughts on coming out of the fog. The video is about 3 minutes.
I describe coming out of the fog as the process of really truly understanding what adoption means at its core.
Coming out of the fog as really an awakening and an awareness, and you kind of really see a lot of things in a way that you just never have seen, but they've always been there.
I would describe coming out of the fog as recognizing that adoption is complex, understanding what grief and loss is. I think that it's critically looking at the adoption industrial complex and understanding the history of why adoption started, where it came from. Coming out of the fog is also understanding the adoption system as a whole, and that adoption doesn't necessarily focus on the adult adoptees as we age.
As with many adopted people, the birth of my son was a catalytic moment for me. This child is the first biological relative I've never known in my entire life. I was 36 years old before I ever knew another person that I was genetically related to.
And I'd say for me, coming out of the fog was when I started exploring parenthood. So that's when I started looking a little bit deeper into my identity and what that meant.
When you meet people that you're actually blood related to, and then you realize that there may be a system behind that, I started to connect the dots that this was just bigger than just me.
Unwinding of how I looked at my adoptive family, how I looked at my childhood, how I look at adoption as a system.
Coming out of the fog comes at you in different ways, at different times, for different reasons.
For me, coming out of the fog was a decades-long experience. I knew it was my right to find out where I came from. And only in adolescence and into adulthood do we start to say, maybe I have some feelings about this.
No, I was not prepared. Being an adoptee, as you know, is very isolating. Finding community during those times was critical.
So part of coming out of the fog as an adult is telling the truth all the time with no shame and no guilt. This is a lifelong journey. I mean, I think it's a really liberating thing, right? To say, wow, what would have been, what could have been, and then ultimately get to the place of, well, this is what is.
So what does this mean for clinicians? First of all, you may be working with an adult adoptee for over a decade, and they have not been ready to talk about their experience as an adoptee. And then all of a sudden, this experience of coming out of the fog could erupt seemingly out of nowhere, although often, as I mentioned earlier, triggered by other things. Or you might have an adult adoptee show up in your practice out of the blue, dealing with these things and not having any understanding of what's going on. It's important to know that coming out of the fog, like all coming out processes, is organic. We do not push or pull people out of the fog. It's our job, if we're working with an adult adoptee, to educate ourselves about their needs and their experience, and then basically be on standby. Also, while coming out of the fog is a normative experience, it is not universal. There are many adoptees who will never come out of the fog, and that is okay. As with all of our social work practice, it's important to consider intersectionality and positionality. Conversations of race and culture should be a part of our work from the beginning. But this is particularly important when we're working with transracial or transnational adoptees. We know that trauma and grief-informed care are really helpful when we're working with adult adoptees. Many adult adoptees have endorsed the fact that EMDR or internal family systems or psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy have all been really helpful. Another thing to consider, like we do with all of our clients, is to assess and scaffold support. So another thing to consider is that we want to support the adoptee's support system. This can be a very frightening and alienating time for an adoptive family who often feels they don't understand and will need a lot of education. And the last piece is the importance of community. It is really important when working with an adult adoptee that we assist them in finding communities where they can connect with other adoptees who've had similar experiences. So some of the things that came out of my qualitative research study were the importance of therapists who were willing to learn about the experience of adoption. Therapists did not need to be specialists in adoption or even adoptees themselves. But what the people in my study told me was that they had really great experiences with therapists who were willing to dive in and lean in and collaboratively work towards understanding what was going on. So the other piece is the importance of community. All the adoptees in the study that I conducted endorsed the fact that community was a life-saving thing for them. In the third and final year of my doctorate program, I created a website that would address some of these things that came out of my qualitative study. Here you will find education geared towards therapists around working with adult adoptees. Coming out of the fog is just one small piece of the information you will find here. This is a great website for clinicians who find themselves working with adult adoptees or are interested in learning more about it. It's also a great website, if you are an adult adoptee, for you to share with your existing therapist. Here you will find research and many videos of adoptees talking about their experiences and resources geared towards clinicians, but also for adult adoptees. I hope that you will check it out and share it, and I would love to hear your feedback and how you're using this website with your clients. So I would like to once again thank the faculty and staff of the Doctor of Social Work program at Rutgers University, and I'd like to thank my cohort, the class of 2024, for your wisdom, your expertise, and your support. I would especially like to thank the adoptees who have participated not only in this project, but also in my qualitative research study, and for all the love and support that I have received from my fellow adoptees in the adoptee community. Here you'll find the references I used for this presentation. My goal going forward is to continue to educate the world about the unique experience and needs of adoptees. I do believe that connection is everything, so here you'll find ways to reach out to me. I love to hear from you. Thank you.